I'm Chrissy Grieger, the Executive Director here at the Winter Park History Museum. And it's hard to imagine that our last event we had was right next door over a year ago, where Randy Knowles was our speaker on his new book that had come out, Rollins After Dark. So it's kind of nice to be here after, a couple weeks after COVID. After that event, we shut down. So we're glad to be here. We have a few audience members here with us, and we're happy to be streaming live today. So glad you all can be here. As well as what this event is for our speaker event series, this also acts as our annual membership meeting. And it announces our board slate for 2021. And I wanted to give our appreciation to our outgoing president, Betsy Owens, who has been our president for the last 2 years. And we are so grateful for Betsy's leadership. She just brings great creative ideas and sound logic and a whole bunch of humor when we're at our board meetings. So we're so grateful to have had Betsy be with us. And she continues on her term through 2023. So we're so grateful for Betsy. So I'd like to invite Betsy to come on up and to announce our slate for 2021.
Thank you, Christy. I was considering mounting an insurrection today to stop the steal, and try to remain on as president, but my supporters didn't show up, so we'll just go ahead and announce the slate. In all seriousness, we're delighted that the folks who are on our slate are willing to serve, so I am going to announce them, and I guess we need a second. And all in favor. So we'll do it that way. The president is Paul Twyford, vice president Yvonne Lees de Braden, treasurer Rick Baldwin, and secretary Sarah Grafton. Do I hear a motion? Linda, and do I hear a second? Second. All right, Rick. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? All right. Thank you very much. While I have the mic, I would like to also take a moment to honor a very special guest today who is with us, Jack Lane. And Jack is our 2021 Winter Park History Museum honoree. And we had to, because for obvious reasons, cancel our Peacock Ball last year, but we are going to be honoring Jack formally at an event this summer. But since he's here today, I did want to say that, actually I'll just read this nice little introduction that Linda provided for me. There is a reason why our 2021 Winter Park History Museum honoree holds the position of college historian of Rollins. For over 35 years, Jack Lane taught history at the college, and his engaging persona made him a favorite mentor for generations of students. As an author, scholar, professor, and advocate for historic preservation and documentation, Jack has influenced the greater Winter Park community. His popular Rollins history books are a tribute to the college he so loves. His big heart and deep local knowledge continue to keep alive the combined stories of Town and Gown, Rollins College, and Winter Park. Our museum is a better institution for the mentoring, guidance, and humor that Jack has loaned our exhibition team over the years. The Winter Park History Museum is honored to be celebrating our fellow historian and good friend, Jack Lane. Details of the event celebrating Jack are forthcoming, but for now, Jack, will you please stand and be recognized? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Jack. We're so grateful that this train is going by right now. All right. So, Jack, we are so thankful for all that you do for the history of our town. And We are working on our next exhibition, which is on Rollins, the first 50 years. And Jack has been a wonderful asset to us because he brings his experience, his time, and his knowledge to our panel. So he's been working with us, and we're so grateful for all that he's doing for this next upcoming exhibition, which I'm excited to announce. We have an opening date of June 10th coming up, so more details coming later, but wanted to announce that today too, and just want to say thanks again to Jack for all he's doing. So to move on with our speaker event, I want to introduce Dr. Claire Strom and Margaret Stewart, who are our guest speakers today. Margaret is a junior at Rollins, and she plans to write her senior thesis on the African American communities of Eatonville and Hannibal Square and do a comparison of the two. So, and then we have Dr. Strom, who's the chair of the History Department at Rollins, and she is well loved and highly respected by everybody that comes in contact with her. We are so grateful to have her working with us too. Claire we work together in an internship program, and every semester she provides us a wonderful intern. And we have loved these interns. They don't go get our coffee either. They do lots of things. They are a part of our team. They do our archiving. They work as a docent. They are in it with us, and they are definitely part of our team. So we're so grateful that we have this partnership. And a kind of a neat story is our last intern that we had was a fabulous intern. We loved her, came very quickly a part of our team. And when we had an opening as executive director, or I'm the executive director, executive assistant, we invited her in. So Devora, who was our intern before, is now our executive assistant, and she's fabulous. So it was just a wonderful, continuation of how the internship program can help these students. And the neat thing is, Devora, she hasn't even graduated Rollins yet, and she has a job at a museum. So it's a wonderful program. So we're so grateful. And Claire also is the author of two of our most popular books in the museum, which speak about on Winter Park history. They're pictorial books, and they are two of our most popular books. And they're these two. And when people come in and want to know more about Winter Park, these are their go-tos. So they're just fabulous pieces of Winter Park history. So without further ado, I will have you ladies come up.
Christy asked me to speak a little bit about the Winter Park books. I did them with students, like the work I've been doing with Margaret. And one of the reasons I did them is that wherever I move, I really want to know the history of the place I live. I want to know what makes it special, what makes it tick, what makes it different. So years and years ago, when I moved to Fargo, North Dakota, I did a pictorial history of Fargo, North Dakota, and it taught me a lot about the town. So when I moved down here, I thought, how do I get to know the history of Winter Park? And the best way seemed to be to spend a summer with two students and my husband, I guess I shouldn't call him a student, immersing myself in the history of the town. We were up in the attic at the Winter Park Historical Society, we were in the Winter Park Library, we were in Hannibal Square Heritage Center, finding photographs, finding stories, and putting the books together. So it was tremendous fun, and if you don't have one of them, you should get one. So I think you will enjoy it. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about the project that Margaret and I are going to talk to you about. 3 years ago, when Margaret was a freshman, she wrote a really good paper for me on African American employees at Rollins. And one of the things she did was she used Ancestry.com to track where they lived and found out that they lived in Hannibal Square. So we decided to spend the summer working on Hannibal Square. And what we did was we took the 1920, the 1930, and the 1940 census, and we mapped them. So there are actually two maps online of Hannibal Square in the 1930s and 1940s, comparing, ownership, who was living in the houses, where the houses were. And then we also compared economic status, what were the people doing in Hannibal Square for work in 1920, 1930, and 1940. And then Margaret expanded that to look at how that compared to the nation, African Americans in the nation, and in Florida. So what we're going to do today is kind of walk you through that comparison as to how African Americans in Hannibal Square had kind of different employment from Florida and the nation, and why. So that's basically the story. And we have a more detailed article on this, which is coming out in September in the Florida Historical Quarterly. So, and it's coming out in the digital edition. So if you want to know more, September, I think Connie told me, is when it's coming out. So, without further ado, in 1910, African-American William Gibson lived on a small farm rented by his uncle in Holmes, Mississippi, with his mother, siblings, and 9 other extended family members. It was his childhood home, and he'd lived there since he was born in 1895. In the next 10 years, Gibson married his wife, Icy, and moved 60 miles to a farm he rented in Sunflower, Mississippi. The Gibsons lived in Sunflower until the mid-1920s, before they moved to Hannibal Square. By 1930, Gibson had 4 children, owned a home valued at $1,800, and was no longer a farmhand, but a worker for a local golf course, known as Golf Links. This upward mobility was unusual for a farmer in the American South during the 1920s, especially an African American. Gibson's journey from Mississippi to Hannibal Square reflected both the dramatic changes that African Americans faced in the interwar years, and also the unique employment opportunities offered in Hannibal Square. As we all know, Winter Park was a small town that was founded in the 1800s as a seasonal home for wealthy Northerners. In its early years, it augmented tourism with more traditional Southern economies, such as agriculture, specifically turpentining, which you guys did a really nice exhibit on several years ago, and citrus production. In 1881, the Sanford-Orlando Railroad line made transportation south easier, which further boosted winter visitation. Bountiful available land, numerous lakes, mild weather, and oceans drew Northerners south and encouraged the construction of winter homes, hotels, recreation facilities such as golf clubs. Thus, as the city of Winter Park grew, its economy became more and more atypical of most agricultural southern towns. The founders of Winter Park, as most of us know, designed Hannibal Square to house the town's domestic health, which was not surprisingly anticipated to be African American. The shift from an agrarian rural economy to an urban tourist-based economy created different employment opportunities for African Americans already living in Hannibal Square, and continued to attract more African Americans, both men and women, from outside the area during the interwar years. Therefore, during the interwar years, and we were focusing on 1920 to 1940, although national and state employment trends for African Americans in relation to agriculture and manufacturing were somewhat reflected in Hannibal Square, the wealthy white community created an environment where domestic labor was much more significant than that found throughout the nation. More generally, Hannibal Square reflected the growth of tourist-based economies in other small towns throughout Florida.
In 1920, around 50% of African American men in the United States worked in agriculture. In the South, they worked on the 3 most lucrative cash crops: cotton, rice, and tobacco. Their labor was most commonly found on large plantations under a system known as sharecropping. By the second decade of the 20th century, sharecropping, which had been met by many African Americans with hope at the end of the Civil War, had degenerated into a crop peonage system that bound African Americans and poor whites in a cycle of debt and poverty. This was exacerbated in the 1920s when, after an increase in crop prices during World War I, agricultural prices plummeted, forcing the sector into depression. In the South, this agricultural crisis was heightened by a widespread infestation of cotton crop by the boll weevil, and in 1927, by the devastating Mississippi River flood that destroyed cropland and impoverished rural communities along the river. While white landowners generally survived such environmental trials, it was often at the expense of their sharecroppers, who found themselves pushed off the land. Many of these joined the black rural exodus to the north that had begun during the Great War, the Great Migration to industrial jobs throughout the Rust Belt. By 1930, the number of black men who worked in agriculture across the country had dropped to 40%, while the number employed in manufacturing rose, reflecting the increase of jobs in urban centers.
While African American men were rarely employed in domestic service, this was where most African American women found employment. In 1920, 50% of employed African American women in the United States worked in domestic service. This increased to 65% by 1930. Most women were employed as laundresses, maids, cooks, and nannies by wealthy families. Generally middle-class white society viewed it as more acceptable and safer to hire black women into the home than black men, due to perceptions and stereotypes that surrounded African Americans. Fearmongers, from politicians to newspaper editors, portrayed black men as lascivious beasts for generations, while black women were more often cast as a mammy, a stereotypical black woman who was happy and contented to serve in the home of white families. Nonetheless, the failure of several economic sectors during the 1920s meant that African American women faced increasing competition for domestic positions from white women. White women servants were more prestigious for employers. As competition arose in the job market, wages decreased, and since no union existed for domestic workers, African American women were unable to reduce the trends towards lower wages and higher hours. African American women who were not in domestic work mainly worked in agriculture or agricultural-based manufacturing during the 1920s. Where am I going here? Nearly 40% of black women worked in agriculture in 1920, but this dropped significantly to 20% by 1930, as the agricultural depression took its toll. Women in manufacturing, who mainly worked in tobacco packing plants in the South, maintained their numbers during the 1920s. So that's the national picture. So now we're going to move and look at Florida.
Employment patterns in Florida differed from those of the country. Agriculture was still dominant for African American men, but more worked in agricultural industries rather than directly as farmers. So the census for 1920 showed more African American men in Florida working in manufacturing than nationwide, 35% as opposed to 25%. In part, this was due to the booming turpentine and lumber industry. This highly mobile industry that laid waste to the southern piney woods became fully entrenched in Florida in the early 20th century, generating a significant portion of the lumber for the nation. The bountiful stands of pines led to abundance of turpentine stills and lumber mills throughout northern and central Florida that attracted African American workers. African American men often worked in the lumber industry seasonally. Half the year they would spend on their own independent farms, and they used employment in the lumber industry to earn extra money. The other main industry of Florida was citrus. Citrus began to gain traction in the late 1800s. Wealthy Northerners like Henry S. Stanford bought large plots of land throughout Central and South Florida to pursue an interest in citrus crops. With the construction of railroads, the citrus industry boomed, and independent orange farmers established small farms throughout the Florida citrus belt. African American workers worked in citrus groves, picking fruit on large farms seasonally, or owning their own farms. Some worked within the industry as packers or truck drivers, and therefore would not have been designated by the census as working in agriculture. The industry moved away from small farms and became corporate during the late 1920s, as growers were hit by a number of natural disasters, including the disastrous medfly that infected nearly 80% of Florida's citrus crop in 1929. A smaller percentage of men worked in agriculture in Florida, with a decline in numbers from 40% in 1920 to 30% in 1930. African American men who worked solely in agriculture often owned small independent vegetable farms and grew crops like tomatoes, cucumber, celery, potatoes, cotton, and peanuts. The decline in agricultural work in Florida reflected national trends like increasing rural poverty and the overall agricultural depression, and also the fickle nature of Florida's weather. For example, a Category 4 hurricane hit the state in the September of 1926, dealing $1.3 billion worth of damage to the state. More African American men were working in the domestic field in Florida, with a slightly higher percentage through the 1920s than throughout the country at around 10%.
The employment picture for African American women in Florida was similar to the rest of the nation, despite a lower agricultural and manufacturing presence. The dominance of domestic work was even more pronounced in Florida, with 75% of Black women working in this sector in 1930, as opposed to 60% nationwide. While the 1920s was bad for some economic sectors, others did extraordinarily well, resulting in prosperity for many. More people had disposable incomes, more people traveled, and so tourist destinations needed more hotels, more restaurants, and more employees to cater to them. Many African American women were employed in this sector, although despite the burgeoning demand, they still faced the long work hours with little pay. A substantial percentage of Black women in Florida worked in agriculture, although the percentage was smaller than that for the nation. These women, like Black men, were concentrated on small independent farms or as sharecroppers and renters. In either capacity, they were part of the nation and state's underclass. In line with the nation, few African American women worked in manufacturing, with the percentage falling from 7 to 5 during the decade.
During the 1920s, employment opportunities in Winter Park were largely driven by Florida's tourist boom. This was not unique to Hannibal Square. Other Florida towns like St. Augustine, Sarasota, and St. Petersburg thrived off of the tourist economy, enticing seasonal visitors with elaborate festivals, serene beaches, and other attractions. African American men in Hannibal Square had different employment opportunities than many people in agriculturally based regions throughout the nation or as a whole or in Florida. The decade showed a distinct drop in the number of men in agriculture from 25% in 1920 to 10% in 1930. Meanwhile, the number of African American men working in domestic service remained consistent at around 33%, a much larger percentage than in both Florida and the rest of the United States. These numbers reveal the different employment prospects that the tourist-based economy afforded African American workers. Instead of working as farmers year-round, they worked as gardeners, porters, or chauffeurs for the wealthy white Winter Park residents.
Employment for African American women in Hannibal Square was even more skewed. Throughout the 1920s, an overwhelming 95% of working Black women in Hannibal Square were employed in domestic work. The wealthy tourist base of the town economy just made more domestic jobs available than elsewhere. For example, Gussie Morton was a cook who had lived in Jacksonville. In 1920, she moved to Hannibal Square with her husband, and they rented a room in a boarding house together. By 1930, Morton was a servant and owned a home valued at $1,500 at 348 Douglas Avenue. Throughout the 1930s, although Morton changed jobs, she always remained a maid or a cook. Morton's experience highlighted the plenitude of employment in domestic service available in Winter Park and its relatively lucrative nature, at least in comparison to other employment opportunities available to African Americans. Overall, throughout the 1920s, Winter Park experienced a tourism boom that led to the growth in Hannibal Square's African American population, which you can see on our maps. The Hannibal Square grew tremendously during the decade. Incoming migrants were attracted to the possibility of domestic work. So one of the things we talk about is how most people in the Great Migration are moving out of the South, but some are moving to more booming areas within the South, like Winter Park. This shifted to a certain extent after 1929, when the stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression strained all sectors of the U.S. economy and made life even harder for those at the margins.
The Great Depression affected African American employment, although not always in ways that was represented in the census. The percentage of African American men working in agriculture stayed about the same as in the 1920s. However, average wages for farmers dropped from $1.60 in 1925 to $1.20 per week in 1932. The federal government attempted to alleviate poverty by easing the hardships of the farm owners, but this hurt the farm laborers in the process. The federal government paid farmers to reduce crop production, hoping to encourage a rise in prices. This led to more laborers falling into deeper poverty as they were often laid off from their land and jobs as landowners stopped producing as many crops. Often these laborers became migrants and moved to large cities, and the number of African American men in manufacturing rose from 25% in 1920 to 40% in 1940. The number of Black men in domestic work also increased in the 1930s slightly, reflecting the growing difficulty to find employment in other sectors.
The number of African American women in the United States working in domestic work also increased during the labor crisis of the 1930s, reaching 70% by 1940. The number of African American women in agriculture fell, reflecting the two-decade-old crisis in that sector. Like African American men, Black women continued to migrate from rural areas, particularly in the South, to find jobs often in domestic work and often in the cities. Despite the availability of domestic work for African Americans during the Depression, the nature of that work changed and working conditions continued to decline in the face of the national economic hardship. Without unions and with high competition for jobs, African American domestic workers often exchanged their work for a pittance, a meal, articles of clothing. Poverty persisted for female African American domestic workers throughout the 30s.
The experiences of Black male workers in Florida did not always follow national trends. The number of Black men in manufacturing decreased 10% during the 1930s. This is most likely because African American men were the first to be laid off from their jobs, along with the overcutting of trees in the piney woods that reduced turpentine and lumber production. In comparison, the number of Black workers in agriculture increased slightly, from 33 to 37%, which perhaps speaks to the continued expansion of settlement along the peninsula.
Florida Black women also found their employment opportunities not fitting neatly into national patterns. The number of Black women in domestic service decreased slightly during the 30s, dropping from 75 to 73%. Many of the domestic workers in Florida serviced the tourist industry, which shrank nationally during the Great Depression. However, the numbers still remained higher than the national average, demonstrating that the ills of the financial crisis were not evenly distributed.
The continuation of a strong tourist economy and the subsequent need for domestic workers is evident in the 1940 census data for Hannibal Square. The number of Black men in domestic work increased from 31 to 35% by 1940. Additionally, although agricultural employment remained static for Black workers nationwide, in Hannibal Square, agricultural opportunities increased. The number of Black men working in the industry rose to 15% by 1940. This was probably due to the arrival of new citrus companies in the area. The biggest of these was the Gentile brothers, who opened an orange packing factory in 1937 on Park Avenue, directly next to the railroad line for easy access to national markets.
While the number of women working in domestic work in Winter Park slightly decreased during the 1940s, the occupation remained predominant. The slight decrease is most likely due to the national decline in tourism. The number of women working in other industries remained constant throughout the decade.
In conclusion, African Americans living in Hannibal Square had different employment opportunities than found throughout the rest of the United States. The tourist-based economy and the wealthy residents provided a substantial stream of domestic work not comparable on a national level. The steady source of employment attracted African Americans to the city throughout the interwar years and helped them weather the economic storms of both the 1920s and 1930s.
Christine, do we have? Yes.
Your data on census, is that available for other researchers to look at online?
Yeah, if you go, it's really, really tricky to use, wouldn't you say? All the census data is available. You just go to the Bureau of the Census and you can dig through and you can find it all.
Yours isn't in a certain place like through Rollins?
No, you through the U.S. government. And in our article, we've got a lot of graphs and charts that show how these things moved, and we talk a lot more about specific people and what they did. Yes, Linda.
Can you give us an example of one of the most remarkable families that you followed as far as their
Well, I don't think we followed it through where they are today, but I know that Margaret's got some stories.
So, on Wellborn Avenue, there's actually a day nursery that was founded in the early 1920s. We actually found the woman who started that. Her name is Rachel Lester. She was, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've looked at the stories, but she was trained as a nurse in Georgia, but then she moved to Winter Park and started this day nursery. Hold it up a bit more. Oh, sorry. So she went to school in Savannah, and she came to Winter Park and founded this day nursery in the early 1920s, and as you can see, it's still going today, and she still maintained it throughout the Great Depression as well. So.
One of the things that Margaret tracked as well using the census was families who had continuity in Hannibal Square. So she tracks people who were here for the whole 20-year period. But then she also did a really nice job of tracking in-migration and where people were coming in from. So what did you find with the in-migration? Where did they come from?
So we found a lot of people coming to Hannibal Square were coming from either northern Florida, so around the Jacksonville area, or from Georgia. It was very, very much concentrated within North Florida and Georgia. So.
Yeah.
We got a question from Facebook Live. Since tourism drove the early Winter Park economy, was the African American labor seasonal or year-round? How might that have affected African American women and men differently?
So I think that it was seasonal to a certain extent. Obviously, a lot of the hotels became year-round. One of the things that started all of this was looking at work at Rollins. And I think that some of the people were working at Rollins in the off-season. Some were working in the citrus industry in the off-season, turpentine industry, and some would just be unemployed. So a lot depends on when the census takers came around, what you're getting listed as employment. It's also interesting to me, just as a side note, I mean, I've worked with the census a lot over many, many years, and I have never seen such crappy census taking as on Hannibal Square, right? They got the street names wrong, they got the family names wrong, they had a 24-year-old woman and the 17-year-old living in the same house was supposedly her son. I'm like, seriously? I mean, could you show any more signs that you weren't paying attention? So that was really interesting, and I'm anxious to see when Margaret extends this to Eatonville, if she finds the same kind of haphazard work, slapdash work. And I also think it would be interesting to compare it to the white side of Winter Park, and I bet you they got the names right and the relationships right in the white side. So, sorry, just a little diatribe there. Any other questions? Yeah, Scott.
I'm interested in backyard gardens and things like that, because when you read about Eatonville, they often said when times were hard, we knew we could grow our own food. And I know that's a tough thing to document, but it's particularly interesting for Hannibal Square because you can't imagine that the lots were big enough to really have much more than a small garden. People have gardens outside of town, or they're community gardens. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about community gardens or gardens outside of town, but one of the things I will say is that in the 1920 census and in the 1930 map, there are people living in the north end of Hannibal Square that are living on what are described as farms, and when we're finding them on the Sanborn maps, they are sizable plots. So I imagine that there's some, home production up there. Obviously, down here, the lots were designed purposely to be tiny. So,
Question.
Yeah, Randy.
You read a lot of Hannibal Square about the business district and how many black people were entrepreneurs and owned businesses. It was a pretty relatively thriving place. Does the census give any indication about how big the business district was and how many African Americans
employ within the business district?
So Margaret found a few hotels and things. I don't think we got a real sense. Well, actually, tell them about your map, because we've got that color, she's got that color coded.
So, on the map that you'll find online, I color coded based on if we knew there was like a school there, or if it was residential, or if it had a business listed there. So there are some businesses that are actually that you can see in. We also labeled churches as well. So yeah, so we did label businesses. So there was like we could see in the census some people who were owning businesses. So like there are some ice cream parlors people owned, or but it's hard. The best indication is probably on the map of where that business district would be.
Yeah, the map really shows nicely the transition from 1930 to 1940, the growth of the town, the growth of the business district. A lot of lots that were just vacant lots in 30 have buildings on them. Some lots that were quite big have had second houses put in behind them. And then UCF did a wonderful job, Richards did a wonderful job, because you can hover over the houses and see who lived in them in each census. So, and Margaret drew all of this on the computer. I don't know how she did all of that. It was wonderful. Yeah, Jack.
Where's all of this leading? I mean, is this just informational, or are there some purpose in this, gathering this information, conclusions to be made?
So I think one of the things we were looking at was, in a town that's different from the traditional southern rural town, how did that affect the African American community? How were their lives different? Yeah. And so one of the things where I'm interested in is when Margaret expands the study to Eatonville, which was a much more independent African American community, how that's going to compare. Are these people going to do worse in the Depression? Are they going to do, as Scott said, and resort to a lot more, home production? So we're interested to see that comparison. I'd like to get into Paramore, but I think that's going to be, it might be harder to delineate, because Eatonville at least shows up as a separate community.
Will it tell us anything about the segregation system? Do you have this information? Was Winter Park different than other ghetto?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the things, so in the work I did on venereal disease during World War II, one of the things I discovered was that most of the people that were arrested for venereal disease were African American, were women. They were pretty much all women. And what was interesting was when I mapped it, all of the African Americans who were arrested, women who were arrested, came from either Hannibal Square or Paramore. But interestingly, most of the white women who were arrested also came from Paramore. So they were clearly, poor white women. Right, so not only was race a factor, but class was also a factor. I'm not seeing anything different in kind of the segregation. You have some white houses in Hannibal Square, but I'm assuming that those are, poor whites. It's not early gentrification. Yeah.
Well, this is simple. For the very sunset town, I'm sure. And if you're black, you have to be on the west side of the tracks. Is that actually a law on the books ever, or is that just more a tradition?
I do not know the answer to that. Jack, do you?
Well, there was I know there was a division in Atlanta. In fact, it's called Division Street in Atlanta, in Orlando. And I came across a good deal of information when I was writing about Paramore and vagrancy. And there was nothing legal, there was no ordinance, but it was well known and a custom that after sundown, whites nor blacks could cross the line of Division Street. Winter Park has or did, I'm not quite sure how far Hannibal Square came up to here. I don't know.
I think it came out, yeah, I think it came pretty much up to the tracks.
Which is a
traditional boundary.
Which is a traditional boundary of segregated towns. Other people have heard stories here. I've heard stories of African Americans who were living in the 20s and 30s and 40s, wandering back and forth over here all the time. And several of them have great memories of living in Hannibal Square and being able to come over here and associate.
There is one story, another student of mine dug up a couple of years ago. So this was talking about Division Street. There were some white kids from Rollins, of course, arrested in Paramore because they were over there after dark, and it was this whole thing. Because I think one of their parents was a faculty member.
Yeah, but that's what's coming on the if she ever publishes it, that's the essay that's going to appear in the quarterly, or the e-quarterly.
Okay.
For historical quarterly.
Okay.
Yeah, he was son of a Rollins professor.
Right. Scott, did you have something to add to this conversation?
I have a follow-up on this. At the University of Virginia, in the 1890s, there were editorials in the student papers asking that the black workers wear badges to distinguish them from the other black people who were being seen in and around campus. The presence of a university or college created a kind of confusion about who was supposed to be where. And I would think that in a tourist town, the same thing. There's so many employers that the boundary is more porous, and knowing who was who and who was allowed and who was not is not as clear. So I think being a college town, that would have something.
Well, in a tourist town.
In a tourist town, I think, I would think it would be very hard to enforce, and I think it's hard to know everybody. You know,
right?
You might recognize some people by face, but you could not make the clear assumption that based on race, you should be over here. And
well, especially, I'm imagining that some Northerners are bringing their servants down with them too.
Yes, right.
So, yes, sorry.
First of all, we have an expert here. Hannibal Square. Maryland told this. But when I did my research for my master's thesis, which was on women's club here in Winter Park, the ideal women's club in the women's club in Winter Park, I was told by many members of the ideal women's club during that era that they were not to cross the train tracks except for employment or emergency. That didn't, to me, that indicated there was no socialization. And also I heard that there were little passes. I've never seen one in real life, so I don't know if that's just urban myth. But I doubt there was a lot of, in Carolyn, you can speak far more to this. It was more employment or emergency.
It was more or less implied that you just knew your place. You knew that after dark, not go across the river, unless you had some kind of official business or sanctioned by someone.
Well, to be fair, white supremacist culture had plenty of good ways of discouraging African Americans from being where they shouldn't be. Right? I mean, it wasn't something that they were going to jump into. So, any other questions? Well, I'm so glad that you could hear our presentation. I really hope you look at the article when it comes out, and I'm going to introduce myself to Faye Lynn because I want to meet her, and I also think, Margaret, she's going to be tremendously helpful, could be tremendously helpful to you if she would be willing. So, thank you all so much. Yes.
Thank you, good job. Good job. Very nice, thank you.
I've got to run, but that was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy.
A photograph?
Thank you for coming, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Could you stand